Hello everyone, welcome to week 5, and this week is actually the last week of the module 1, and today we'll talk about state, nation, and I'll give you a brief introduction to what we'll cover today. So first of all, we'll have a definition and the functions and characteristics of states, and then we'll move on to the challenges and threats to states. And finally, very shortly, we'll talk about nations because nowadays we call states nation states. So we'll have a chance to talk about why we call them nation states, but not something else. So let's start with bad news that we received. We lost a very important, powerful feminist woman. I'm, of course, talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And maybe we can have a conversation or discussion tomorrow about the replacement of the justice. There is a big debate right now going on between Democrats and Republicans, and maybe we can talk about it tomorrow, which is quite related to actually states. So let's start with the definition of the state. What is a state? So state is an organization, first of all, that has a number of political functions and tasks. So we live in very crowded societies, right? So because of we live in with other millions of people, we have to think about different conflict of interests. So those are quite natural. There are also coordination problems, right? So environmental pollution or externalities that some economic sectors are creating. So because of all these major issues that we face as human beings, we need a higher organization that actually controls and sets some rules for the people living in the society. So actually, when you look at the human history, human beings try to live without states, and state is a kind of a stage in the history that they came up with a kind of an idea. But of course, there are different versions of looking at this creation, right? I call it creation, but it is social creation, social constructed creation. So it is an organization. So basically, if you are a Marxist, though, you probably will have a more negative view of state because you probably see state as an agent of the class, the social class that owns the means of production. I'm talking about bourgeois. So for the Marxists, for instance, the state is actually a servant of the interests of the bourgeois class in order to repress and oppress the working class people. But if you are a liberal, then you might actually have a different view. Or if you have a conservative, you might have a different view. That's exactly what we discussed in the last 2 weeks. This is why I think this week is perfect, so that actually it brings the whole discussion of power and the ideology together under the one heading of state. So what are those tasks and functions we are talking about? So one is security. I already start to kind of mention that. So let's assume that we live in a state of nature. This is a Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbes version of viewing the emergence of state. So at some point, according to Thomas Hobbes, people as rational creatures come up with the idea that we cannot live under these circumstances in state of nature. So because the powerful one is always winning against less powerful one, in order to live in a more harmonious society, we will deliver some of our rights to a higher organization, so that organization is going to protect us, especially our private property. That's the main reason the existence of state from the liberal perspective, of course. So this is one. Another one is extracting revenue. So we'll come to that. What I mean by that is, of course, taxation. So forming rules for resolving disputes and allocating resources. All these are very important functions of states. So let's look at the definitions and characteristics. So states are organizations claiming ultimate rule setting and rule enforcing authority. So basically, in a given border, geographical border, if a state is a sovereign state, we'll come to that definition in a minute, it means that the state has the ultimate rule setting and rule enforcing power or authority in that border. And there are examples in the world that you can see that some states cannot necessarily claim that ultimate rule setting or rule enforcing authority. I can think of countries like failed states right now. Syria is in civil war. Afghanistan is another example. We'll also come to that as well. So states also may be organized as unitary, federal, or confederal systems. As you all know, the US is a kind of a textbook example of federal system, but there are also other federal systems like Brazil, Germany, Spain, and there are also unitary systems like United Kingdom, France, my own country, Turkey, is an example to unitary systems. We'll come to that as well. And sovereignty is the actual ability of states to act as ultimate rule-making and rule-enforcing organization. And finally, another important characteristic of any given state is legitimacy, which is the belief by citizens that the state operating over them is proper, or state has the right to rule. Okay, so let's talk a little more in detail the functions of the state. So the security, states may create large military establishments. So I think US is a good example of that, because when we start talking about US is a special case. It's not only a state in itself, it's also kind of an empire, right? Because United States has also land outside of the main borders of the US, as you know, as 50 states. There are other, actually, some island nations and some other groups of people who are under control of the US. So this is important because US does not necessarily have the responsibility to keep its own land secure, but also other countries, especially the world. This is why it was a big discussion when Donald Trump got elected, before even he got elected, that he wanted to actually change that, right? In terms of foreign policy, he wanted to adopt a more isolationist foreign policy. We'll all discuss in all of these in detail in the following weeks. So what is extraction of resources? So states may create tax structures. Of course, when I say tax in this country, you can directly think about IRS and how IRS is applying its rule on the people. Or they also might rely on natural resources. As I mentioned, Saudi Arabia last week during our synchronous meeting. Because states need revenues, because they have to fund this expensive social welfare programs, or sometimes those social welfare programs are limited based on the revenues that actually states are collecting. Americans are almost always, complain about the taxes, very high rates of taxes. But when you compare the U.S. taxation, the rate of tax in this country, with other advanced industrialized developed countries, especially European countries, Northern European countries. So they're actually the gap is huge when you compare those taxation. So in Scandinavian countries, the taxes can go as high as 45-50%, maybe even higher, especially for the upper class. So because of that, of course, in those countries, you can find a wider welfare state and funds for the people. Another important function is setting ultimate rules of conflict resolution. So some states have judicial review, as we talked a little at the very beginning, because of the Justice Ginsburg. And some states actually do not have judicial review. So another important one is rules for resource allocation. So some states might adopt a more capitalist approach, some states might adopt a more socialist approach, or they might actually combine both of these. Like, again, as an example of welfare states in many European countries. So even though we are talking about like socialist or social democratic systems like Scandinavian countries, but they are still market economies. So they are still capitalist economies. And finally, in enforcing its rules over the territory within its borders, of course, a state may rely primarily on force, like physical aggression. So this is exactly what we deal with the power, the weak that we deal with power, and then persuasion, so the issuance of decrees or laws, manipulation, it's kind of propaganda using media maybe, or exchange, like fostering a growing economy with a high standard of living in order to buy some acquiescence from its citizens. So at this point, I might ask you to question, let's think about how state affects or touches your lives. So maybe we can have a discussion about this tomorrow. So it does not necessarily, we are aware of that, not necessarily every day, but when you think about carefully, actually state has a very significant, important impact on our lives, even on our daily lives, like extracting resources, rule making, security. So all of these are can be thought as abstractions, but they are at the same time ways in which states touch our lives personally and continuously. So I don't have much time, but in the rest of my time, I just want to talk a little about the challenges to states' authority. So our reading this week classifies these challenges as multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations, and intergovernmental organizations. So multinational corporations, I think it's very easy. You already know about this. Like Apple is a good example. Amazon is a good example. Walmart and, for instance, Sears, they can move their shirt making jobs to Bangladesh, where they actually benefit out of cheap labor. So they are all threats and challenges to the state's authority, because all states want to keep those very important manufacturing jobs inside their country. But these are, especially in capitalist systems, they are their own agents, their own actors, so they not necessarily obey the state. Another one is non-governmental organizations. I think all of the environmental organizations, especially Greenpeace is one of the most popular, they are definitely challenging the state authority, especially if they see that a state is polluting environment systematically. And then, of course, there are intergovernmental organizations like United Nations, like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These are very important organizations for multiple reasons, especially for the security. But there's also one that actually we have been talking a lot recently because of the pandemic, which is World Health Organization. So you also need to know two terms. I will be very quick. One is sovereignty, which is traditionally been understood as the attribute states have when they carry out the tasks of providing security, extraction, and rulemaking, those three very important functions. And if they cannot deliver those, they are called failed states. And then legitimacy. I already talked about legitimacy, so this is why I'm going moving a little faster. Finally, let's talk about nation. So how are you going to describe nation? A nation, this is a very conventional way to define. We can definitely define it in other ways, but a group of people with a sense of unity. So based on the importance of the group attributes to a shared trait, attribute, or custom. So a common language, religion, ethnicity, race, culture, they can be all these foundations of the national identity. So there is definitely a very important aspect of identity here, especially social identity. So in-group versus out-group relations. So a nation arises when this significance, this is very important, significance is attached to that which the group shares, or around which a feeling of unity develops. So there has to be a feeling of unity when we talk about nation. And most of nations in the world have their own states, but there are also nations without states. Like, for example, the Quebec people in Canada, they don't have their own state. They have autonomy within Canada, but they don't necessarily have their own state. Catalans in Barcelona, they are actually pushing Spain. They are pushing for their independence. And of course, the most crowded the group of people in the world, Kurds. They are the biggest nation without their own state. So it's almost 15 minutes, so I will stop here so I can talk a little more about these tomorrow in our synchronous meeting. Have a nice day, take care, stay safe.